Okay, today, 30th May, we continue to be in this tense situation where the Russians have given warnings, President Putin himself has given warnings about potential Russian retaliation if the Western powers allow Ukraine, as they say, or rather assist Ukraine to conduct long-range missile strikes deep inside Russia, and where the Western powers, aware of these Russian warnings, are debating with themselves what they're going to do in the light of the rapidly deteriorating military picture in Ukraine. Now, there have been further Russian warnings today. The first came from Dmitry Peskov, who is Putin's spokesman, and this warning, by the way, undoubtedly has been authorized by Putin himself. And the point that Putin is making is that if the West goes ahead with this incredibly dangerous plan to authorize, or to undertake missile strikes deep inside Russia, well, if that happens, it will backfire ultimately, both on Ukraine and on themselves. And the title of the report in TASS of Peskov's words reads, NATO countries' intention to continue war with Russia will backfire. And the article then goes on to say the United States and other NATO countries intend to continue the war with Russia, which is fraught with serious consequences for them. The Kremlin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, drew the media's attention to the escalation of the situation by NATO member countries, and especially the United States. He emphasized that these countries themselves intend to continue the war with Russia in the literal and figurative sense. This will, of course, inevitably entail consequences. It will ultimately be very harmful to the interests of those countries which have opted for the path of escalation. NATO countries, primarily the United States, are consciously heading for a new round of tensions and provoking Ukraine to continue a senseless war with Russia. NATO's member countries, the United States in particular, other European capitals in recent days and weeks, were coming close to a new round of escalating tensions. They're doing this on purpose. Moscow hears quite a few bellicose statements. This is nothing but a policy of provoking a new level of tensions. We realize that this negative trend in their approach unfortunately persists. They provoke Ukraine in every possible way to continue this senseless war. So what Peskov is saying, and as I said, he's undoubtedly been authorized to speak by Putin himself, is that if the West continues along this line, it will end up badly, obviously for Ukraine, which is being led on into a war which it is bound to lose, and which it is indeed losing, and losing disastrously. And at the same time, it will in the end backfire on the Western powers themselves, who will face consequences as a result of the inevitable Russian retaliation. And to repeat again what Putin, Peskov, other Russian officials have been talking about is retaliation on a global scale. And as I've discussed in many places and in many programs by now, that allows for possible attacks not just on European territory, which the Russians have signaled they might consider, but also on military facilities, British military facilities, conceivably American military facilities in all parts of the world, everywhere that they are located, and of course the Middle East is an obvious place. So, there we are. Another warning from Peskov. There's also been more comments from other Russian officials, and importantly, they're also being republished by TASS. And this one comes from Viktor Vodolatsky, who is a member of the Russian Parliament, the State Duma, and he's obviously being assigned the role of supervising the integration of the various local regional parliaments in Donbass and Lugansk, and I suspect also Donetsk region, into the Russian Federation, and who therefore clearly is a conduit between the Russian parliament and the authorities in Donbass, and who by definition therefore must be close to Russian thinking when discussing the situation in Ukraine. And this individual, obviously much lower down in the hierarchy of authority in Russia, but certainly not someone we should ignore, Mr. Vodolatsky, he's telling us, and he's spoken to reporters, he said that the buffer zone in Ukraine could potentially including Kiev, depending on the West's supplies of long-range weapons. And the TASS report, covering Mr. Vodolatsky's statements, reads as follows. In mid-March, President Putin said Moscow would have to reconsider setting up a buffer zone in Ukraine if the West gave Kiev permission to use long-range weapons to strike Russian territory. That is actually something of a misrepresentation. As I remember, what Putin actually said was that there would be a buffer zone. The Russians would be obliged to create a buffer zone to protect their territory if Ukraine continued to conduct cross-border raids and artillery and rocket strikes on Russian towns and villages like Belgorod. Interestingly enough, TASS has taken that and is now talking about a buffer zone expanded if the West gives permission to Ukraine to use long-range weapons to strike Russian territory. And this, to some extent, what Vodolatsky is now quoted as saying, actually reproduces a warning given way back in the autumn of 2022, as I remember, by the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, who also said at that time that if Ukraine is provided with long-range missiles, then the Russians ultimately will have no option but to extend the buffer zone, in effect to bring under their control even more Ukrainian territory, extending perhaps all the way to the Polish border. But anyway, this is what Vodolatsky is actually reported to have said. The size of the buffer zone will depend on our Western adversaries. The more lethal weapons with a range of more than 200 to 300 kilometers they send, or should these include the latest heavy missiles with a range of 500 kilometers, he's referring obviously to the Taurus missiles, a 500-kilometer wide buffer zone would have to be established so that missiles don't hit Russian soil. As the distance between Lugansk and Kiev stands at 482 kilometers, the buffer zone should include Kiev. So that means, in effect, if Taurus missiles are supplied to Ukraine, and notice that Vodolatsky is not talking about Ukraine with Western assistance actually conducting long-range missile strikes on Russia. He talks instead about Ukraine simply receiving long-range missiles If that happens, if the Taurus missiles are indeed delivered to Ukraine, then Russia will advance further westwards, and that will include the capture of Kiev itself. That's what Podolsky says. He spoke to reporters, presumably in the Duma, the Russian parliament, where of course he's based. He's probably again been given some kind of green light to speak to the reporters in this way, and the TASS news agency has reproduced this. Well, what are Western governments doing? I think we've had a fairly clear clue from the comments that have been made recently by President Macron of France, and which have now also appeared in an article in the New York Times. My impression, and it is only an impression, is that for the moment at least, but only for the moment, the disastrous idea of long-range cruise missile strikes deep inside Russian territory have been shelved. Macron's words can perhaps be interpreted to have a wider meaning, extending to the possible launch of long-range cruise missiles onto Russian territory. But the New York Times article clearly seems to specify the use of American weapons for fighting on the border zone. And that, of course, is consistent with Ukraine's recent complaints. The Ukrainians have been saying, quite falsely as it happens, that the reason they haven't been able to repel the Russians successfully in the Kharkiv region is because the Russians are able to concentrate large forces on the Russian side of the border, and because Ukraine isn't authorized to shell those Russian troops on the Russian side of the border. That means that the Russians are able to concentrate these forces at will and advance across the border without undue risk. Now, anybody who's been following the fighting along the border, not just recently, but for quite a long time actually, knows that this is complete nonsense. Ever since the Russian forces began to concentrate on the border in advance of Russia's incursion into Kharkiv region, the Ukrainians were shelling them there, and the shelling has enormously escalated since the fighting in Kharkiv region began. And previously, Ukraine launched multiple strikes with long-range artillery and especially Vampire, Czech supplied Vampire multiple launch rocket systems deep into Russia itself, or at least in the border areas, and of course targeting the city of Belgorod specifically. So the claim that the Ukrainians have not been able to undertake artillery strikes on Russian positions across the border is a complete fiction. It's not been reported in the West that that is happening, and that, of course, has enabled this fiction to take hold, but it is a fiction nonetheless. If what the New York Times is telling us is the American plan, then in principle, it changes very little. It probably does allow Ukraine, however, to enlarge the scope of its artillery operations, and of course it would enable Ukraine to conduct these artillery operations openly, no longer pretending that they are the work of dissident Russian forces and dissident Belarusian forces all of that pretense will have gone away. So it's possible that this is the plan. My impression from the New York Times article is that the proposal, however, for long-range missile strikes into Russia using Western cruise missiles, Taurus missiles, ATACMS missiles, Storm Shadows, though they may not have the necessary range, that for the moment has been taken off the agenda following the Russian warnings. I say that because I believe that that was the original plan. Just saying. Anyway, that's where we are at the moment. Now, we're going to have a meeting, a NATO meeting, I believe tomorrow, where the NATO powers are going to discuss this. There is a clear split. Italy has made it absolutely clear that its weapons cannot be used by Ukraine in any form, in any way, to shell Russian territory. So Italy already seems to be taking its, trying to distance itself from what the Ukrainians are doing. Few Western countries have come forward and have basically said that Ukraine can use its weapons for cross-border shelling. I understand for the moment that that is all that is being discussed. And of course the Czech Republic effectively gave permission weeks ago. As I said, we saw the Czech vampires being used against Belgorod and all of that. Anyway, there have been other countries that have agreed to this. But I would say that in some of the cases, there's a list circulating of supposed countries that have granted this permission. This list appears to me to come from the Ukrainian media, and it doesn't seem to be sourced on actual policy decisions made by Western governments. It's just been cobbled together out of statements that Western officials have made, including statements which, from what I can see, some Western governments have even retracted. So I don't particularly take this list particularly seriously, but I do believe that this permission for cross-border strikes will be given at this NATO summit meeting. But for the moment, it won't go beyond that. For the moment, because I still think that with this plan now having been floated, sooner or later, we will see it revived, and I think it will eventually come into effect. We will eventually see attempts to launch ATACMS missiles into Russia. Though the ATACMS continues to be a failure, we'll come to that in a moment. I suspect that the Germans will eventually, despite Chancellor Scholz's publicly declared opposition, agree to the supply of the Taurus missiles to Ukraine. We will see these missiles used, and we will see these Russian reactions. But I suspect that that is now some weeks away. I think for the moment, the fighting will continue mostly along the border, and here it is that the Russians are going to make some moves. Before I proceed, I should say that again and still, I have received a number of comments from a number of people who still seem to think that the Russians are being incredibly weak in simply appearing to rule out cruise missile strikes, and that they're not treating mere artillery strikes at red lines, and, well, that they're not acting in some way that I don't myself fully understand. Reading some of these comments, I always get the sense that if artillery strikes or rocket attacks happen, even if these are completely ineffective, that the Russians are supposed to respond with missile strikes immediately against Western territories, or even perhaps threats to use nuclear weapons, or perhaps demonstrations of nuclear weapons. There are some Russians who talk about these possibilities. Also, in Russia, a personality within one of the Russian think tanks, Dmitry Suslov, is apparently proposing that Russia detonate a nuclear device as some kind of warning signal to the West of Russian capabilities. I'm going to say straight away that I think those measures would be wholly disproportionate to what is actually happening. And proportionality is not only a legal doctrine, which it is, by the way, but it is also a military doctrine as well. It is not in Russia's interests to escalate the war in that kind of way. Why should it? It is winning. It has already responded to the Ukrainian attacks on Belgorod and the border villages by launching a border incursion into Kharkiv. That has backfired on Ukraine. The Ukrainians launched those cross-border raids. They shelled Belgorod. They might perhaps have been expecting a bigger, more dramatic Russian reaction. What they ended up doing instead was reactivating a front which up to that point had been quiet, that has overstretched their resources at a time when their resources are already extremely depleted, and it has been a strategic disaster for them, and by the way, for their Western sponsors as well. That seems to me a logical, rational, well-calibrated response to what has happened up to this point. Of course, if the West starts to escalate in a way involving use of cruise missiles, as I said, a far more dramatic escalation than what we have seen up to this time with the border, well then of course that whole question of a Russian response will need to be revisited, which is exactly what the Russians are now telling us. But as I said, for the record, I think that the Russians up to this point have reacted in a proportionate way, and one which has worked decisively to their advantage. It's important also, I think, not to completely disregard in all of these discussions the wider international picture. Every day, more and more political leaders in all sorts of places can see who seems to be looking to escalate the crisis in Ukraine. The fact that the conference, the so-called peace conference, the West has tried to convene in Geneva, is withering away to the point when President Biden himself no longer intends to go. Tells us that the international response has become increasingly negative to the way in which the West has been conducting itself over the course of this conflict. The fact that more and more leaders from more and more places around the world are happy to work with the Russians, so that, for example, all sorts of important people like the King of Bahrain are prepared to visit Moscow, and so that Putin is received like a conquering hero in places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Well, that tells us that, again, most countries around the world are looking at the Russians and seeing that they're responding in a balanced and proportionate way. Now, I know some people are going to discount the importance of that. I disagree. I think it matters a great deal. I don't think it is in Russia's interests to widen the war. I don't think that that's what they're wanting to do. Why should they, when they're winning the war as it is being currently conducted, and when they have shown that everything that the West has tried to throw at them in Ukraine itself has ultimately failed. So there we are. That's where we are. I think at the moment, for the moment at least, the plan to launch long-range missile strikes on Russia has been called off. It's all going to be operations on the border when the Russians continue their advance, when the crisis in Ukraine deepens, when the deterioration in Ukraine's overall situation becomes greater, then the proponents of escalation in the West will resume their demands for deep strikes onto Russian territory. And then, of course, we will come again to a further crisis, which it would be far better that we would never found ourselves in at all. But let's look at the situation at the moment. First of all, over the course of last night, there were more missile strikes by the Russians against the Ukrainians and by the Ukrainians against the Russians. And the Ukrainian strikes were carried out specifically against Crimea itself. And the Russians have provided us with comments about those missile strikes, the Ukrainian missile strikes on Crimea. They say that 8 US-made ATACMS missiles were used, all of them apparently, according to the Russians, shot down. The Russians are saying that the Ukrainians failed completely in all of their attempts to hit targets in Crimea. In other words, this missile attack was a complete failure. There was also apparently or supposedly attempts to conduct water drone attacks on Russian targets. The Russians have increased their understanding of how to combat water drones. They're developing, by the way, water drones of their own. We'll see how they're used, or if they're used at all in this conflict. It's not clear what they would be used by the Russians to do, by the way. But anyway, the Russians are now starting to field, apparently, their own water drones. But anyway, they have now provided film of FPV drones being used to destroy Ukrainian water drones. Something which begs an awful lot of questions. How did the Russians know that the water drone was where it appeared to be? Were the FPV drones launched from a ship? Or were they launched from land? Where were these drones destroyed? Anyway, lots of questions, but quite an interesting film. Anyway, the point is, the attack on Crimea was a failure. The Ukrainian attack on Crimea was a failure, according to the Russians. Independent reports appear to corroborate this. The governor of Crimea has said that some damage was done to some bridges in the north of Crimea, but this was purely down to debris, and the bridges will be repaired and will be back in use within the next few hours. So, according to the Russians, an unsuccessful missile attack, 8 ATACMS destroyed, and according to the Russians, 4 Ukrainian water drones. The Russian attacks, the Russian missile attacks, far more powerful, taking place all across Ukraine, in many locations. And the Russians have provided us with a very terse account of what the purpose of these attacks were: operational tactical aviation, unmanned aerial vehicles, missile troops and artillery of the Russian group of forces engaged Ukrainian manpower and hardware clusters in 112 areas during the day. So it looks as if this time the missile and drone attacks were focused against concentrations of Ukrainian troops and also against places where the Ukrainians have been gathering such equipment as they have left. The Russians are not telling us how effective or not this strike was, but they do say that they engaged Ukrainian manpower. There's lots of reports apparently circulating in Ukraine about people hearing all sorts of explosions. And I'm hearing reports that, again, one of the targets was the airfield at Starokonstantinov, which is widely expected to be the primary base for the F-16s when they eventually appear. Now, the F-16s, it's an endlessly shifting date when they're supposed to appear. The latest time frame that I've heard is October. Others say as early as June. I'm not going to try to guess. But there has been a rather curious or interesting development there, because Sweden has apparently donated its only two Saab 8-9C AWACS aircraft. Sweden developed this AWACS system, apparently buying a powerful ASAR radar from the United States and installing it on a Saab turboprop aircraft. Apparently 6 of these aircraft were built altogether. 4 have been exported. 2 have served with the Swedish Air Force. Sweden has announced that both of these AWACS aircraft, expensive and valuable systems, are now going to be donated to Ukraine. Now, that begs many questions. Who is going to be operating these aircraft? If we assume that they're intended to work alongside the F-16s, well, in theory, that would create a significant additional capability. But are the Ukrainians trained to operate AWACS aircraft, even if these are rather less sophisticated AWACS aircraft, in fact, far less sophisticated AWACS aircraft than the ones fielded by the United States and indeed Russia? Operating AWACS aircraft is not something one learns to do, I would presume, very quickly. It would require very skilled, highly trained technicians. I'm again assuming this to be the case. One would expect or presume that this would be something that would require weeks, months, probably even years of training to be done effectively. So, have Ukrainian technicians been training with these two aircraft for some time already, even though we've never heard any reports to that effect? Possibly. Or are these aircraft actually being delivered but are not expected to be used until the Ukrainians have achieved the level of proficiency to operate them, in which case they won't be operating, I suspect, for at least a year? Or will they be operating with Western technicians? Just saying. Either way, they are bound to be targets for the Russians. And these are bulky turboprop aircraft. The radars themselves, apparently because they're very advanced, maybe they don't create many radar emissions, and they themselves supposedly difficult to jam, though the Russians have demonstrated that they're able to jam extremely advanced systems. They're jamming the Starlink system, for example, which was supposed to be jam-proof. I remember people saying this. So who knows? But the propellers of the turboprop aircraft will certainly be visible to long-range radars operated by Russia, and that will enable the Russians, I would have thought, to be able to track these aircraft without much difficulty. And the Russians have aircraft with very, very long-range missiles in the theatre, and of course they have even more powerful AWACS systems of their own. I wouldn't personally rate the survival chances of these two aircraft very high. So if Western technicians are indeed operating them, well, presumably they're being paid quite a lot to do that. And I wonder whether they've been fully or properly informed of the risks. Anyway, we will see how this turns out. I can imagine a situation, by the way, where these aircraft, if they're going to operate at all, are going to need to be protected by F-16s, so that a significant part of the F-16s that are being delivered to Ukraine are going to be required to protect these two aircraft, these two AWACS aircraft, from Russian attacks. And I wonder whether even that is going to be effective in the end. But anyway, we will see. It's an interesting development. It begs many questions. I wonder where these aircraft are going to be based. They're not, as I said, difficult to spot. The Russians will be monitoring them, I suspect, quite carefully. We will see how that turns out. Meanwhile, alongside the missile strikes, we've been getting all kinds of reports from the battlefronts. And I noticed that General Syrskyi, Ukrainian commander, is now saying that Ukraine has established a reserve of shells, and that the shell crisis for the moment has abated. I suspect these shells are those which have been supplied from the various recent deliveries provided by the United States. And on the basis of what we have seen previously in the war, what tends to happen is that Ukraine runs through this stockpile, which is probably relatively small, very fast, and the shell famine returns each time at a graver, more extreme level. This brings me on to a subject where, if I may be excused, I'm going to take something of a victory lap. There's been a fascinating article in the Financial Times about President Pavel's famous scheme, or at least infamous scheme, perhaps some would say, to buy ammunition, to buy shells on the international arms market. And when I first heard about it, I said what would happen, what I thought would happen. I said that anybody who goes in the middle of a war seeking to buy shells on in the international arms market with large amounts of money, billions of euros to spend, is going to find, as night follows day, that the various arms dealers that person is having to deal with are going to rub their hands with delight, instantly raise their prices, and that the shells, when they do appear, are probably fewer in number and in far worse quality than the buyer expects. I said that would happen as night follows day. I predicted it in programme after programme. My colleague and friend Alex Christoforo said exactly the same on his channel. We discussed it with each other in various programmes that we did on the Duran. And lo and behold, today I read this article in the Financial Times. Czech ammunition supplier CSG warns of poor quality of parts sourced for Ukraine. Czechoslovak group, the largest ammunition supplier in Central Europe, warned that rising prices and poor quality meant that half the shells it had received could not be sent to Ukraine's battlefields as quickly as planned. A Czech-led initiative to buy artillery ammunition for Kiev would start delivering rounds in June. Michal Strnad, owner and chair of CSG, told the Financial Times, but about 50% of the parts acquired by his company on behalf of the Czech government in places such as Africa and Asia were not good enough to be sent without further work to Ukraine. For some shells, CSG is being forced to add missing components from its own production. Every week the price is going up and there are big issues with the components, Strand said during an interview in his company's Prague office. It is not an easy job. Nonetheless, we're told, despite all of that, that the project is still on track. Though quite how, given that half the shells provided are apparently duds, I am completely unable to see. And then we go on to read that the war, this is from the Financial Times, the war in Ukraine was helping to send prices soaring for the limited number of shells that could be purchased outside of the EU at a time when there was no spare ammunition in Europe. Strand warned, he said that the order books of European ammunition makers were full for up to the next 8 years, depending on the types of parts, even as all of us are increasing the capacities. Even in the unlikely scenario of Ukraine's war finishing right now, Strand said, there will be huge work in front of us to replenish the strategic stocks of NATO countries. Well, I would love to say, I told you so. So I'm going to say, I told you so. This is exactly what I predicted would happen. And here we see that it is exactly what has happened. I am absolutely incredulous that European leaders went ahead with this idiotic plan. Of course, some people, the arms dealers and the brokers and the middlemen and all of these people that Mr. Strand and his company and the Czechs will have dealt with, well, they will have done really very well out of this. But I had no idea that the function of the European Union was to make arms dealers and all of these other people around the world happy with European taxpayers' money. That was what I predicted would happen, and it has happened. The fact is, Ukraine will get some shells in June, in nowhere near the numbers that it was expecting or was led to believe, and the quality of the shells will be of a variable quality, even if the Czechs do carry out repairs to the half that have turned out to be duds. It's questionable how many of them can be supplied at all, by the way. And in the meantime, as Snad tells us, despite all the claims about Rheinmetall churning out more shells for Ukraine, which I've read in some places, Snad, who is the person who actually knows, tells us that there is no spare shells to speak of. There was no spare ammunition in Europe, Snad warned. That's in the Financial Times. It will take years to replenish NATO's strategic stocks, even on the basis of the planned increases in production, and the books of European ammunition makers are already full up for the next 8 years, so that there is really no way to increase further supplies from Europe of ammunition, artillery ammunition, to Ukraine. This has been a dismal, sorry saga. It's been one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. And as I said, I should pat myself on the back for predicting it. But really, it was so obviously, painfully predictable that I wonder whether I should take all that much credit. Anyway, that's the problem with shells. The United States, we're told, is on the eve of completing work on a new factory that's going to increase production of shells to 30,000 rounds of 155 millimeter shells a month. That, by the way, I suspect clarifies realities about actual US shell production. I suspect that the real limit on production of artillery shells in the one factory in the United States that is currently producing them, the one that we've been hearing so much about, and which has now reached apparently 36,000. I suspect that's probably the plateau that can be achieved. That can be achieved there. I suspect the true capacity of the United States in overall shell production is probably, including with all the new factories that are coming on stream, is probably around 80,000 rounds a month, and perhaps even less than that. And I doubt that that will come fully on stream before 2025, the end of 2025, at the earliest. And I know that there are some people now who think that even that is over-optimistic. Now, the West apparently now estimates that Russia is currently producing 4.5 million shells a year. That's the current rate of production. That is an increase from around 3 million shells a year last year. I understand that in factory space for producing shells has been expanding further in Russia. And as we see, the Russians are well organized in this field. Supposedly, the price for of a shell in Russia is a quarter of what it is in the West. I suspect that it is substantially less than that. Remember, as volumes grow, the price per unit falls. It's an iron rule of industrial process, which many people seem to find difficult to understand. I think that Russian shell production next year will exceed 5 million shells. It might eventually go up further still. But I don't want to say that I have an oracle, that I have a oracular abilities or a crystal ball, so I'm not going to predict how far up, how far higher it will go. Anyway, What is going on the battlefields themselves, even as the Ukrainians have a few more shells to fire? What is the actual situation? And here I'm going to say, I think it's getting worse for Ukraine every day. Now, in recent programs, I've said that it seemed to me that Ukrainian forces, there are Ukrainian troops now trapped in two locations, that they've been encircled in two locations, call them cauldrons, if you will. And I've noticed that increasing numbers of commentators are coming round to that view also. The first is Volchansk. I have been saying for some days that it seemed to me that the Ukrainian forces in this area of high-rise buildings north of the Volcha River in Volchansk are in effect cut off from resupply, and that they're in effect encircled and trapped by the Russians. And, well, more and more commentators, I've noticed, are starting to say that that is the case. I noticed that the Military Summary channel also said it in one of its recent programs. And I believe that we have an identical cauldron situation in the micro-district east of the aqueduct in Chasiv Yar. The fighting for the micro-district is horrific. As I said, the pictures, when you see them, are horrifying. But the point is, the key thing to understand is that the very brave soldiers who are fighting inside the micro-district, Ukrainian soldiers, many of them may have all kinds of political ideas, which I would personally find abhorrent, but there's no reason to doubt their motivation and their courage. Anyway, the fact is that they're cut off and they have no available line of reinforcement and retreat. And that spells their doom, just as the like encirclement in Volchansk would appear to me to spell the doom of the Ukrainian troops who are trapped there. So I wouldn't myself call these cauldrons. These are sieges rather than cauldrons. I think a cauldron actually is a somewhat different thing. But anyway, the point is that there are Ukrainian troops, probably several thousand if you join the two places, if you add up the forces in both places. Ukrainian troops in both of these places are trapped with no means of escape. Sooner or later, these places will fall, and when they do, Ukraine will have lost many brave men, and the Russians will have continued their advances. So already that looks bad. And we're getting more reports today that the Russians are finally planning, are about to launch rather, their advance into Sumy region, and that could happen at any time now, at some point probably over the next couple of days. We don't know the size of the force. We don't know whether it'll be as limited in size as the one in Kharkiv. We don't know what the eventual plan is, but it does look as if another operation in Sumy region by the Russians is about to be launched fairly quickly. And yesterday I mentioned that the Ukrainian Defense Minister, Rustem Umerov, is saying that the Russians are likely to add 300,000 men to the battle before long. It's difficult to give a precise guess as to the total size of the forces Ukraine has on the battlefronts. But with 500,000 Russian troops fighting inside Ukraine, and I think that is a generally acknowledged figure, if the Russians are indeed intending to commit a further 300,000, and as I said yesterday, they have sufficient troops to do that, then it is a catastrophe for Ukraine. I cannot see how the Ukrainians could possibly withstand an additional force of that size. They would be facing forces of around 800,000 men across the entire line of contact, and I would guess that their resistance would quickly crumble. Now, Umarov is presumably getting his information from Western sources. He's probably right, though of course I don't know. I mean, I can't corroborate this, but note, going back to Mr. Wodolatsky, he's talking about the Russians perhaps conducting an operation to take Kiev if the West supplies Ukraine with long-range missiles. Putin in the past spoke about Russia needing 1 million men to take Kiev. That was a discussion he had with Russian war correspondents roughly a year ago, as I remember. He laughed, as I remember, and said that only he knew whether such a plan existed. Which is an interesting comment at the time. Well, 800,000 men is not 1 million, but it's starting to head towards that point. And for the record, perhaps the Russians could put a force of that size together if they needed to as well. Certainly, apparently, they are still recruiting at the rate of 30,000 men a month, perhaps even more. And as for Ukraine, there has been a really distressing article which has appeared in BNE Intelligence. And I should say, I owe a debt to the historian Jeff Roberts, because it is through his assiduous work that I find, that I get information about these articles. This was one article I certainly missed myself. And anyway, the article says that Ukraine's mobilization, public support versus private resistance. And we read about the enormous resistance that the mobilization law is encountering. The shortage, we also read that the shortage of manpower on the front line is acute. Both the Ukrainian military and Western allies have been pushing hard to make the government facilitate mobilization. But the prolonged hesitation is easy to understand when you hear what is happening in real-life Ukraine, not inside the brilliant minds of military strategists and information warriors. And then there is a whole series of really distressing accounts of events in Ukraine as young men, presumably they're mostly young men, have tried to escape conscription. We're told that 11,000 Ukrainian men illegally crossed into northern Romania since the start of the full-out Russian invasion 2 years ago, according to Radio Liberty. I suspect it's more than that, by the way. And then we read that the Ukrainian leadership knew well that the mobilization law would be extremely unpopular, so they kept postponing it despite considerable Western pressure. It was only adopted last month, a few days before the US Congress finally unblocked $61 billion in military aid to Ukraine. The synchronization at least guaranteed that mobilized soldiers wouldn't be fighting the Russian army with bare hands, but the question of what they're really fighting for is dogging Ukrainian society, and despite superficial appearances, it is difficult to say what Ukrainians really think on that matter. And then we are given very good reasons to doubt, the article gives very good reasons to doubt some of the claims made that Ukrainians still support prolongation of the war. It makes the point that people who speak out against the war risk facing charges and being arrested for, quote, justifying Russian aggression, and that this can happen in social media posts and has happened even as a result of private phone conversations. And the article points out that opinion polls in Ukraine, in the vast majority, are conducted over the phone. And anyway, the point is that there is not only increasing resistance to the mobilization in Ukraine, but it isn't going to change the outcome of the war. And more Ukrainians appear to understand this, and that, as the article puts it, the scope of material which demonstrates resistance to mobilization in Ukraine is just too overwhelming to be dismissed as abnormal behavior by people lacking the sense of civic duty or as the result of Russian propaganda. It shows a growing rift between the public face of Ukrainian society, as presented by cheerleaders calling for war till victorious end, and the private opinion of real-life Ukrainian citizens. And so mobilization is not going to resolve Ukraine's problems. It's probably going to make them worse. The BNE intelligence also tells us that Ukraine is losing the drone war, and we've had pictures of an enormous factory in Russia and Tatarstan able to make more and more drones. And Yuri Butusov, by the way, the Ukrainian blogger, actually himself acknowledged this. And anyway, all of this playing out on the battlefields, the ammunition crisis not being resolved, the numerical advantage tilting massively towards the Russians with far more drones, Ukrainian troops in Volchansk and Chasiv Yar surrounded. What's going on in other places? Well, I read a very interesting article in Redovka, the Russian newspaper, which is now providing some very, very interesting articles about the war, the Russian conduct of the war. And it made a very interesting claim. It said basically that the Russians could, if they chose, without too much difficulty, advance to the Oskol and Zherebets river lines. There are, however, large numbers of Ukrainian troops located in that area, and if they did that, there would be very, very heavy fighting. But they would successfully push the Ukrainians across the rivers onto the West Bank. The Russians, by the way, Redovka didn't say this, but it looks to be the case also that the Russians could also, without much difficulty, push the Ukrainians in the area of Klishevka and Andreevka, west of the aqueduct. Now, a couple of days ago, after Klishevka and Andreevka fell, there were claims that the Ukrainians had withdrawn all their forces to the west of the aqueduct. But it's clear that this has not happened and that fighting is still taking place. But Redovka says that it is not in Russia's interest to do this because the policy of the Zelensky-Syrsky government is to defend every millimeter of Ukrainian ground. The Ukrainian leadership construes the continued presence of Ukrainian troops east of the Zherebets and Oskol rivers and east of the aqueduct as a success. And that allows the Russians to grind them down in these places, to inflict ever-increasing casualties upon them, to destroy their hardware, to, in other words, conduct aggressive attrition upon them. Whereas, if the Russians made a big offensive push and pushed these troops to the west bank of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers and west of the aqueduct as well, well, those troops would be intact and they could conceivably even be redeployed elsewhere, and there might be an incentive then for the Ukrainians to establish stronger defense lines. So it actually works to the Russian advantage to take it slow, to attrition these Ukrainian troops, to play along, rather, with Zelensky's and Syrskyi's mistakes. And when the Russians do eventually arrive on the east bank of the Zherebets and Oskol rivers, and what they will probably do in a couple of days in the Kleshevka and Drevka area, on the eastern side of the aqueduct, the Ukrainian forces will be so depleted that it will be easier for the Russians to advance beyond these places. And in the meantime, the Ukrainians are keeping troops in places where they are fulfilling no real strategic role. This may seem strange, but to me it makes complete sense. I have repeatedly said that I do not understand why the Ukrainians sacrifice so many soldiers and equipment defending undefendable positions. It seems that the Russians have understood that and they've adapted their tactics accordingly. They're working to play upon Ukrainian mistakes. Well, anyway, there we are. So, potential for a major Russian advance in northern Ukraine, but possibly ultimately, if 300,000 men really are committed, conceivably even advance to Kiev. That possibility is now being floated again. And in the meantime, Ukrainian troops cut off in Volchansk. No sign, by the way, of any Ukrainian success in Lipsy, the other place that's been fought over in Kharkiv region. Reports that the Russians are concentrating armored forces in this area as well, possibly preparing for further advances, and a horrific battle going on in Chasiv Yar. The other places where I think the news is fairly dramatic is that it does seem that the Russians are continuing to enlarge the gap they've created in the Ukrainian defense lines in the Ocheretino of Devka area. They appear to have reached Karlovka, the next village west of Netailovo, which they captured a few days ago. As I said in my program yesterday, the fall of Karlovka puts the Russians within reach of Selidovo, one of the major Ukrainian logistics centers. This is the place where they stockpile their supplies for the Ukrainian forces fighting elsewhere in Donbass. And there are reports now that the Russians have advanced deep inside Novo-Alexandrovka, west of Ocheretino. And, well, I'm not saying that that village is about to fall, But it does seem as if the Russians are making significant progress in this village, and that they're close to achieving their objectives there also. And there's been less news from Krasnogorovka recently, the other fortified town where the fighting continues to happen. I suspect the situation in Krasnogorovka is not very different from what it is in Chasov Yar and in Volchansk. Ukrainian troops effectively surrounded by the Russians, maybe not quite as tightly as in Volchansk and in the micro-district in eastern Chasov Yar, but their position increasingly precarious, with Kiev showing no interest in their pleas to be allowed to withdraw. There's been lots of news about Russian advances in the Vremivka salient. Yesterday there were claims that Staromayorsk has fallen completely under Russian control. Also reports that the Russians have now captured the greater part of Urozhaine. I don't understand very well the fighting that is going on in this place. I haven't given it much attention. So, a continued Russian offensive all along the eastern front lines. Perhaps another even bigger offensive about to begin. The West perhaps backing off for the moment from its missile strike plans, but those remain, I suspect, in the background, ready to be revived. And in the meantime, the Russians giving very strong warnings about the colossal risks the West is taking if it continues down this route. Well, the war in Ukraine is reaching its most dangerous point. Glenn Deason has been saying for some time that the most dangerous point will come when it finally dawns on the West that they're going to lose in Ukraine. And that moment is now almost upon us. There are still some people who believe that one way or the other the things can be turned round. I suspect that a lot of hopes are now riding on the F-16s. The ATACMS, as I said, have been a disappointment, just as the Storm Shadows before were, but the next wonder weapon is the F-16. If I'm right in what I'm thinking about these AWACS aircraft that the Swedes have been strong-armed into donating, I think that these are indeed intended to operate alongside the F-16s. And I'm going to guess that it'll be Western technicians, perhaps Swedes, perhaps Americans, who will be asked to operate these systems, probably at exorbitant costs. Every single Western weapon that has been sent to Ukraine has been a failure. The tanks have failed. I remember the euphoria last year when the decision was taken to supply the tanks. I remember the crass predictions that these Western tanks would sweep all before them. I remember the absurd claim in the Financial Times, of all places, that a Western tank compared with a Russian tank was like a contemporary Lamborghini up against a 1950s Volkswagen or something like that. Anyway, the tanks failed. The HIMARS, the small diameter bombs, the Excalibur, The JDAMs, the HARMs, they've all failed. Other weapons, the M777s, the Caesar howitzers, they failed too. They're too delicate for war. They constantly break down. The Caesar can only be used for a couple of rounds before the barrel has to be changed, or otherwise the accuracy plunges. Similar problems with the M777s as well. All of these weapons have failed, but now the hope is that the F-16s are somehow going to turn the tide. A couple of months ago, I remember there was lots of talk about a vast fleet of drones that was going to be supplied to Ukraine. The European Union was working to get those drones together. Ursula von der Leyen herself, I remember, was taking a personal interest in the project. Well, Ukraine is losing the drone war. It's the Russians who are winning the drone war. It is they who are outproducing Ukraine and the West in drones, with many, many more apparently to come. And of course, if the Chinese become involved here, then it well and truly is game over. Anyway, the drones, all of that, it's all failed. Electronic jamming by the Russians on a scale that no one can match in the West. The Starlink system now being successfully jammed. The Russians probably gradually gaining an advantage there too. So, as I said, it all rests on the F-16s. The F-16s are going to fail as well. That has been the consistent pattern of every weapon system. I forgot to mention the Patriots and the NASAMs and the IRIS-Ts and all of those. Not only have they not succeeded in stemming the tide of the Russian missiles, but many of them, of course, have now been destroyed, and it's clear that there is no means to replace them. The plan to try to get European countries to donate their Patriot missile systems has, as a recent article said, it's fallen flat. So everything has failed. It all turns on the F-16s. If, or rather when, they fail too, that will be, I think, the moment of maximum danger, especially if the Russians by this point have taken places like Chasiv Yar and Volchansk, and they're encamped in Sumy region, perhaps besieging Sumy itself, perhaps even sending probing towards Kiev. And that will be the moment of decision that the West is ultimately trying to put off. That will be the moment when they will decide whether to engage in deep strikes with missiles against Russia, despite all the warnings which have been made, or in the alternative, whether to send ground troops to Ukraine. There are already, of course, plenty of Western troops there. Increasingly, more of them have been killed. One of them was killed in a Norwegian uniform, apparently. But of course, Norway has not formally announced that its soldiers are in Ukraine. So it's still under the radar, even though the numbers, the presence of these troops is there for everyone to see. But whether there will be a public announcement of the deployment of Western troops in Ukraine. Germany, by the way, has cancelled its plan to reintroduce conscription. I think they understand perfectly well that if they're going to reintroduce conscription at a time when there's even discussion of sending German troops to fight the Russians in Ukraine, there will be a political crisis in Germany, the like of which we've never seen. Anyway, all of this going on, we will see what the West does when that moment of decision comes. Do they escalate? How far do they go? Or do they finally do what some people in the United States are telling them to do. Back off, focus on China instead, and prepare for the next war they will fight and lose, the war against China, the war which of course also has the potential to end us all. Well, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Surprise Star. Also, remember that you can go to our shop, get yourself the amazing things you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.